My name is Jim Barry. I'm going to be presenting a paper on school-based financial education. And this actually dovetails quite well with Leslie's presentation from this morning, talking about financial inclusion. So thinking about financial literacy in Lesley had a nice kind of flow chart, which kind of had information as a barrier to financial inclusion. And financial literacy can be seen, as a way to improve information, but also we can think about it as a way to improve financial decision making if you just happen to have access to financial services, and just being able to just promote good decision making more generally. And so thinking about these, there's a lot of different financial education programs out there. And if you think about it globally, there's a lot of programs in the U.S. and in developed countries trying to promote financial literacy in all kind of shapes and sizes. And most of it focuses on adults. Okay? And as Ashley mentioned, the evaluations of these programs seem to have mixed results, although, as she mentioned, there are some kind of stylized facts that might not in these studies. But there's a lot less research on financial education programs for children. And there still are a lot of programs. And I'm going to be talking about a very large, at least expansive program around the world that aims at school-age children. And the idea being that if you target children early, you can kind of get them to form habits and to get them to actually starting to think about financial decision making early on in their lives. So what we're going to do is try to add to the evidence base, and this is going to be a very kind of a small, maybe a small sub-bullet of what Asa's presentation actually was, and thinking about a particular setting in which we're evaluating a program that aims to improve financial literacy among youth. So what we're going to do is evaluate this program called Appletoon. Appletoon is a financial and social education program, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means in a second. It's this very big, at least expansive NGO. It operates in 102 countries, including many countries in Africa. And what the program is it provides both financial literacy and social skills training. Again, I'll wait to describe the curriculum for a minute or two. It's an after-school savings club, and usually it's run by school teachers. So what they do is they get one or two school teachers in the school to provide training, these kind of skills training to children after school in what they call a savings club. And it targets a very wide range of grades in schools, basically primary through high school, although the focus is a little bit more on middle school level. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this NGO, I think you kind of can see it in this model in other sectors, is what they do is they have Appletoon's base basically provides curriculum and training, and they outsource what they're doing to local partners, and the local partners do the implementation. Okay? And so what that means is that as an organization, they can operate in many countries with sort of less of their own sort of physical staff, and it, as in their model, allows for local buy-in, so that the local NGOs can be kind of invested in the process, and so that they might be able to adapt the implementation to local conditions. And so Appletoon, I don't think they've actually been around for very long, but they expand very, very rapidly. It's kind of an interesting model to think about anyways. We're mostly going to be here. We're going to be really studying kind of does the program itself work. But I thought it would be kind of interesting just to mention the kind of model that they have and how much reach this organization actually has. So what we're going to ask in this one study is what the impact of the Appletoon program is on the social and financial knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors of the children who are actually affected by the program or in the program. And then what we wanted to do was Appletoon is actually this this financial and social education program, and in some of the the literature on financial literacy really focuses more on financial literacy, and there's this kind of social aspect to the Aflatoon program that we were kind of interested in teasing out. So we actually introduced a program that was basically the Aflatoon program was stripped out of the social education component. So we are evaluating also this basic financial education and access program, and again we're going to look at financial knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors of the kids who are targeted by the program. So that is hopefully going to yield what the additional effect of the social education component is. So this is a common thing to do in field experiments, is that you try to tease out effects of particular aspects of a program by kind of either starting with the full program and stripping out parts and adding that to your evaluation, or you can start with nothing and kind of build up until build up the layers of the program, or even you could do one bit of the program or another. So the way we did this was a randomized field experiment in 135 schools in Ghana with grades 5 and 7, so kind of around the middle school level. So now we'll talk about the curriculum. So Aflatoon has a curriculum that provides both social and financial education. It has a mascot. This mascot is named Aflatoon. He's a fireball. And he kind of leads children through the curriculum. Right? So this is done through weekly club meetings after school. The way it was done in Ghana is it was delivered through the NGOs. And again, the NGOs were the ones providing the financing, and Aflatoon was providing the training. Okay? And the way we evaluated it was Aflatoon, as they're expanding, as I mentioned, they're expanding very rapidly. So as they're expanding, we kind of took advantage of the planned expansion of the program into Ghana. We actually didn't have much of a presence in Ghana when we started, and randomized the rollout of the program. Okay. So the curriculum has a financial education component, as I mentioned, which teaches children about things like budgeting and planning, why they should save. It encourages entrepreneurship and actually thinking about starting these really, really micro businesses and just getting them used to the ideas of entrepreneurship. And it has a savings club component where children are encouraged to save at school rather than stay at home under the mattress. Okay? And the social education component teaches children about things like child rights, and there is kind of this empowerment aspects, and one of the bits of it is thinking about child labor, and teaches them not to be exploited, or that at least they have the right not to be exploited through child labor. There's a fairly significant component on thinking about gender sensitivity, and they talk about health issues also, like HIV/AIDS. And this is actually, the social education component, if you actually read through the curriculum, is a very substantial part of the curriculum. So it's not just financial education with a little bit of social education tacked on, it's really both. And that's really their goal. Okay? So we're evaluating the Aflatoon program, and then we as researchers at Innovations for Poverty Action, we basically designed, with the help of Aflatoon, this stripped out program we called it the Honest Money Box, which it's just the financial education component of Aflatoon, right? Without the social education component. We gave it its own mascot, perhaps a little less colorful than the Aflatoon fireball, but he's an honest money box. Okay. I'm not going to go through again the components of this is basically exactly the same as what the Aflatoon financial education component is. Okay. So this was a randomized control trial, as I mentioned. We started with 135 schools, and we just randomized into these three groups: Aflatoon, the money box, or control. Okay, we did the randomization before We did this in 3 regions of Ghana where we had 2 partner NGOs, and this is where they were operating. 2 were rather rural. One was the East Volta district, and one was the Western district, and then we had a bunch of schools in Greater Accra. So it's kind of in the south of Ghana, but it was a mix of kind of peri-urban, I guess, and rural schools. Okay. This was carried out between the end of 2010 and 2011, so it covered the 2010 and 2011 school year, and we've got about 5,000 kids in our sample, and we managed to, we were very pleased actually that we managed to resurvey almost the entire sample. It's actually nice when you're doing these kinds of evaluations to have a sample that's in school and not terribly mobile, and so you actually don't have to spend a lot of time chasing after respondents to keep your attrition low. Okay. So what kind of outcomes are we looking at? So we focus most of our outcomes on the main things that you want to look at for evaluating financial literacy. So we looked at savings rates, the different locations where they save, mainly inside or outside of school, the amount saved. We have some questions on attitudes towards savings, sort of preferences for savings and spending. We collected a bunch of information on work. This was actually a policy, in the policy sphere, is a criticism of the Aptitude program or any kind of child financial education program that it might make children want to work at the expense of going to school because it teaches them the importance of money, and you're not really making a lot of money by sitting in school, right? You will, but you're not while you're still in school. So we had a bunch of questions on that, and then we measured things like risk and time preferences, how children were spending, and a measure of financial literacy. We tried to make it as applied as possible. We actually had these kind of hypothetical games where we said the children were allocated a certain amount of money and they had to spend it on certain goods and kind of get their spending and kind of add up to their budget. And we kind of measured whether they were able to kind of allocate their money in the way that we, to spend their budget, and also kind of how long it took them to do that. And then we have a bunch of measures of things like confidence and these things called like locus of control and the well-being of the children, and how whether they feel kind of empowered by the program. And this was really more to play to the social education component. Okay. So what I'm going to do, so we have a ton of outcomes in this study. You'll see that most of them kind of point in the same direction. But what we do is we have kind of families of outcomes and we aggregate them together. So some of the families of outcomes will show positive or no evidence for an impact. It's a little hard to interpret the magnitudes when we aggregate them together. So what I'm going to do is mostly talk about the individual components. But just keep in mind there's a lot of things going on, although you'll see in a second that we don't find a whole lot. So the results. So in terms of savings behavior, so if you starting with basically the stars on these estimates, is basically each row represents either the impact of Aptitude, the honest money box, and then the second to last column is the mean and the control group and the number of observations. So across all of our savings behaviors, we do see a positive impact. Where this comes from, right, so both treatments increase the savings impact. Forgot about the yellow boxes. So we do have some small evidence of an impact on whether the student has any money saved. So it's about 3% on a base of 50%, so it's about an increase of 16 percentage points. This is kind of on the very, very edge of statistical significance. So it's, I would say, kind of suggestive evidence, but not terribly conclusive that the program programs increase savings rates. The point estimates are actually about the same. There were no significant increases in the amount saved, but big shifts basically between having big shift into having savings at school and how much money was being saved at school. So in the control group, only about 3% of the kids were saving at school, and that increased to about 7% in the aptitude group, and a little over 10% in the control group. Okay, but it didn't seem to. Okay, so it didn't really change whether the student had money saved outside of school, and the total amount of savings, which is actually not. It's actually not in this table. The total amount of savings actually didn't change much. So what we see is basically a shift of savings into savings at school, maybe a slight uptick in the savings rate, but nothing terribly overwhelming. Right? So we do see some evidence that this had changed savings behavior, but I wouldn't say it was I wouldn't call it necessarily a fundamental change. Okay. So the only other set of numbers that I'm going to show you is for work. In here. The work index, based on all these outcomes that we had for work, the Honest Money Box did increase the work index significantly, and it mostly increased it through the incidence of work in the past 4 months to earn money. So it increased by 4% off of a base of 24%. Okay, but when we look at conditional on working, the number of days worked, we actually don't see many changes. So the thing to worry about here with whether these programs actually encourage work, I think, at least in my opinion, is whether they encourage kind of very heavy amounts of work that would very substantially displace schooling, right? And so what we don't really see much evidence of that. What we do see is maybe is an increase in work, some small increases in work, not a lot of increase in sort of very intensive work. I mean, this still qualifies as child labor through the ILO definition of child labor, right? But it doesn't necessarily qualify as, a very, very intensive or heavy child labor. Okay, and we do have other evidence that school participation didn't really change across the treatments. Okay, so it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I don't think terribly severe. And again, this is only in the Honest Money Box treatment. It's not necessarily in the aptitude treatment. Okay? And then we have some other results, and basically not much going on in any of the other results that we measured. Quite surprisingly to me, there were no significant impacts on financial literacy, and this doesn't really seem to be driven by statistical precision. It really does seem to be that not only is there no evidence of an impact, the impacts are probably not very big, okay, if any. We don't see any impacts on the other things that we measure, like time preferences, spending patterns, preferences for different types of spending, these confidence measures. Okay. So just to kind of sum up what we find in the study, and then I'm going to try to just kind of broaden the discussion a little bit, is that we do see shifts in changing behaviors, in savings behaviors from the programs, but not really increases in the amount saved, and perhaps maybe marginal increases in savings rates. Okay. But we also don't find significant impacts on the other things that we might expect from a financial literacy program, such as financial literacy, or as kind of, we decided to measure it, time preference, confidence, and other things that we think at least a financial literacy program or these kind of social training programs should do. And then there's some evidence of increased work in the money box treatment. One way to interpret this is that it increased the drive to be financially independent, not necessarily purely financially independent, but just what I would say more financially independent in that treatment. And the mechanism, what I think is that, I think there's two potential mechanisms here. So one is that this money box treatment had a simpler message, and part of that simpler message might there is some research that these simpler messages might have a better chance of getting through than a sort of a longer set of program goals. And so that might have actually made the impacts of the money box a little bit stronger. And it could be that the social aspects of Appleton did put more emphasis on schooling, rather than working, which may have sort of shifted away from working. Although we're not completely, we don't have a ton of ancillary evidence for those mechanisms. Okay. So just to think about kind of the overall impact of the programs, and just thinking about the kind of general design issues of child financial literacy programs in general. So the programs we see, they did change behavior, but they might not be as large or broad-based changes as expected. They certainly, they did disappoint Appleton when we showed them. So why is this? Well, Appleton is an after-school program, and so children can decide to go or not, right? And so take-up, or the participation of kids in the programs actually matters. So participation, it was about 20% or a little over 20%. In Appleton schools, I think that's pretty normal. But that makes me think of at least like whether the model of having an after-school intervention is, maybe we should think about having an in-school type of intervention where it has the potential to reach more kids. Okay, and I've actually done some work in remedial education, which basically does make this comparison, and after in-school interventions, definitely can have that kind of reach. You could think about the curriculum and whether the Appleton curriculum is a little too complicated, and thinking about kind of keeping it simple, kind of stylized fact. But one thing I should mention though is that on its money box, it seemed to be a little bit, at least as effective along the savings dimension, but it doesn't mean it was necessarily more effective, and I wouldn't call either one of these things wildly effective. Okay? One thing the first thing that Appleton pointed out that after we showed them the results, and something that is actually very important, is that these programs are meant to affect very long-term outcomes, which as an evaluator is very difficult for us to measure, because you would have to do very long-term tracking of kids, and you would have to figure out what kinds of outcomes to actually measure over the long term. And so, maybe we're not really thinking about the right time period. And there are programs that have basically no effects in the short term and large effects in the long term. But I think that it is somewhat suggestive that if we don't find big shifts in behavior in the short term, even along these kind of small dimensions that don't necessarily, these increases in savings are not necessarily going to really cause large increases in consumption smoothing relative to the total income of the household. But just thinking about whether maybe it is that these things are going to manifest themselves over the longer term. And then kind of thinking about, as a lot of times when I present evaluations, one of the very last things I ever say is more work is needed. And in this case, I think, replicating these kinds of studies, understanding the mechanisms, we actually would, kind of purposely did more of a reduced form impact evaluation because basically we weren't sure what, really where to look. And, understand the mechanisms of this particular program, we're to study kind of a range of programs. As I mentioned at first, I don't think the evidence base is very deep with these sorts of programs. But I will mention, there is one other study that co-author on this study, Dean Carlin, has worked on along with a couple of his co-authors, is a financial education for youth program in Uganda. It's called SALSA. And SALSA was basically encouraging savings through either financial education or providing a savings account for youth groups who were already kind of formed through the Church of Uganda. And what they find is that the financial education component actually did increase financial knowledge, savings, and even earnings, okay, for this older age group. So, it's a little bit tentative to try to compare these, two very different program evaluations. But just to think that, a couple of the maybe salient differences here. The savings intervention was conducted with pre-existing groups that were already formed, and there was no real sort of choice of taking it up or not. You actually were in the group, and your group got the program. And so here the program effects are not going to be diluted from non-participants. Something in terms of at least the impact on participants, this is an older sample. So these might be people who actually might have a little bit more agency in terms of earning money and spending money in the household, and maybe that's probably why you might see more stronger impacts. But I think overall, all of this, and kind of just repeating what I said on the last slide, I think our evaluation, even though it didn't really find huge impacts, I think the goal, and it's something that we kind of try to say over and over again, is experiment. And there's two parts of it. One is experiment with programs and thinking about the different kinds of programs that actually show the process, where the process appears to be working. And then the second part is experimenting with impact evaluation and actually running experiments on these programs that appear to be promising. And I think that we're kind of scratching the surface here, and that there's probably a lot more to be done. Thank you.
So just to recall the research question, there's this importance of financial literacy. It's of course not only in developing countries, and there are many examples of financial literacy programs which are targeting the young, but there's no experimental evidence on the impact of these programs, and there's this fundamental trade-off, if the causal links are there, that if you increase financial literacy, then people might take better financial decisions, of course in this instance for their welfare and ultimately for the development of the country. But then they have higher marginal utility of money, which may increase incentive to work, and therefore there's a low investment in education, which might be problematic for which is problematic for school-aged children, depending on the magnitude, of course. So what exactly do you do in this paper? So you take these 135 primary school and junior high schools in southern Ghana in 2010-2011 school year, and you have two treatments. So I sort of frame the thing inversely. You frame it as Aflatun and something less. I think it's easier to think of it as honest money box and then honest money box plus, as I call it, which is all the features about the honest money box curriculum, basically about financial literacy training, plus social skills and children's rights, including awareness against child labor. So all in all, I really think that this is a very nice paper. It's very well structured, very clear, very easy to read. And it's of course very relevant because we really need to know more about the effectiveness of these programs. However, as you mentioned, the impact seems to be limited, and I do agree with you that we cannot conclude against the effectiveness of these programs because of course you need the evidence on long-term impact. So ideally what you would want is to follow these children into adulthood and see how they are going to make their decisions, financial decisions later on in life. And here is a very short run. It's 9 months after treatment, and these are very young children. So my comments, I think, I don't have anything, fundamental to say about the design of the randomized field trial. But the paper is a 10-page draft plus all the tables. So I think you should take these comments as, questions that the interested reader may have when reading the paper and, trying to improve the writing. There are many questions that come to mind. So, just a few comments on the setup of the study. You target 5th and 7th grade students, so my guess is these are age 11 and 13. It could be important to learn a little bit more about what sort of money do these children have their hands on, and how autonomous they are in their financial decisions, and of course how can this impact your results. What is their weekly endowment, the real magnitude, so not only in terms of the currency unit. This is something that we totally miss in the paper. So you mentioned the currency unit of Ghana, but I have no idea about its real value. So, and of course, it's very important to learn a little bit more about the context of the interviews, because it's not clear to me if the children. So the teachers were the ones running the savings club, and they were also, of course, running the curriculum, like teaching students, the pupils, But then when they are surveyed, is this anonymous? Are they sure that no information leaks to the teachers? Because when I look at the individual outcomes, I sometimes have the impression that they just want to make a good impression upon the teachers. And it's important, maybe it's not the case, but then it's important that you find some way to convince the reader that this is not the case. Okay, so I don't know if you have data for this, but I would really like to see a comparison of the treatment and control groups along the socioeconomic variables. So of course you have randomization, you have stratification of the sample, but you stratify the sample along, well, number of tracks generation and number of textbooks at the school. But I would really like to see something about the income and or education level of the families, if you have access to that, or at least of the geographical area, just to make sure that there are there's no heterogeneity that may be driving the results there. Okay, so contrary to what you really focus your presentation on savings and work, and my discussion goes through all the indexes that you provide. So in savings, almost the only positive effect is on savings at school, as you mentioned, and here I'm really, worried that the students may be responding to peer pressure or just trying to cause a good impression on the teachers. However, one could argue that since the other outcomes are self-reported, then the cost reporting with outcomes is very large. They could say, well, I'm saving a lot at home too, and no one can check that. So, but this could be nice to discuss this. So then I need to have an idea of the magnitude. So you have the average money value, but how does it compare to the cost of an essential food like milk or rice? I'm thinking about a Big Mac index adapted to the reality of these children, or childhood such as candies or both. And of course the issue of income heterogeneity, and of course, but this is another experiment. It's to give each child an endowment and let her manage it. Although still, of course the marginality of money would still vary depending on how rich you are, but at least we'll be sure that they would have the same amount of money to invest, to save. Okay, so in terms of work, I really like this result because I see results as favoring the the honest money box plus, or the after-tune treatment over the honest money box, because it seems that the ethical component of the education package counteracts the incentive toward money. And the only effect that remains is the positive one, which is an incentive to save, although of course it's very low as you pointed out. Stripped out of the negative one, which would be an incentive to work. So I think framing the results in this way could actually be very appealing. And it would actually please after two, maybe. Okay, risk and time preferences. So again, I'm worried that the pupils may be trying to impress the teachers, although, I'm sure you can, by really looking carefully into each component, convince me that this is not the case. But in terms of risk-taking, they increase self-reporting as risk-averse, but they do not change the gameplay behavior. So it's like they really do not perceive that the games are risky situations, and so they just respond whatever they really think that they should do, but then when the risk word is in the survey, then they react. So I'm again worried about this. And time preference, here the only thing where there's positive effective treatment is on regret from not doing homework. So it's really, I was like, well, you really want to impress your teachers, but I may be wrong. Okay, then the remaining parts of your analysis. I didn't get what was correct money allocation, and I don't think there's, in the paper you actually explained, because I was thought, okay, I'm given an amount. It depends on my preferences, basically. What do you mean by correct money allocation? Then here again, in the temptation goods game, it's crucial to have a sense of magnitude. Okay, so for instance, I just the back of the envelope, looking a little bit at the numbers. The amount spent on snacks in the last 7 days is 0.58 of the currency unit, which is around 10% of the total spent on self in the last 7 days for the baseline. For the control group. And it would be so. Having this idea of the magnitudes would give us an idea of how much room is there to increase or decrease this someone subject to treatment, because if you're not spending that much, then how much can you actually decrease? So I was puzzled, and I have no idea what this means in terms of number of shrinkers. I have no idea. Okay. It's so it's not a lot. So there's no room. I mean, they don't have much room to. That's what I guess, because it's a poor country, of course. And then the expenditure analysis, there are several items which are not decided, like the number of times you have eaten fish or meat in the past 3 days. I was puzzled by this. I was like, what do the children, how much can they impact these household decisions? Unless you are trying to measure spillovers effect into the household, but then it would be nice to know this explicit. Okay, but again, I really think that these are all small comments that you can take into account because you have a 10-page draft and it would be, easy. I'm sure it's easy to argue with your results on all these points, and then you can make your paper more self-contained. But it was really a pleasure reading it. Okay, so now I think we have like 5 minutes for questions from the audience.
Two questions. So I was wondering about whether there is a pattern in terms of children starting in the program and then leaving because whether maybe parents don't like it, because it seems like this program is taking the power of the parents, right? And the second question is really about the parents. Have you measured anything regarding the parents? So, like, it would be nice to see whether it could have effects at the household level. Those would be quite sensitive, actually. So, I was wondering about that.
Great questions. So the one thing that I think that in terms of the design that's a little bit limiting is that we have pretty limited information on attendance. We do have information on membership for some of the groups, and it's a subset of those we have attendance, and so we can look at that. I don't think we've looked at frequency, but I mean intensity is obviously a very logical thing to look at. So it's something we definitely need to do. In terms of spillover, I think this kind of relates to the comment about general spillovers on the households, and we did have a bunch of sections in the survey from that, and I think we looked at a few basic ones, and they need to work their way through the paper. We looked at them, and I'm pretty sure we didn't find anything. And so, we're kind of building a paper that's a lot of null results, but obviously if you have null results, you need to report them. So, but that was one of the, and I think, maybe to broaden this a little bit, I think that was one of the things that I found kind of intriguing about this project in the first place was kind of whether this kind of thing could trickle up into the household. It's possible that a more powerful treatment could do that. And I think, I do other research on sort of children and child agency within the household, child decision making relative to parent decision making. And I think, I think this is kind of an interesting space for more researchers to actually see what kinds of interventions focused on children can actually have these kind of trickle up effects in the household. I'm not sure it's this one, but I think NOVAFRICA actually has a paper or two that actually does try to directly get children to affect their parents' behaviors, and she does find some effects on those dimensions.
Another question, comment by the audience? Okay, so I think that's fine because actually it's 4 p.m. and we have a coffee break now, so you are welcome to join the next room where we have lunch, and yeah, there will be coffee, and then we come back here at